I haven't fully arrived at the digital age. I still carry my Bible around and okay. Oh, great. Good morning. It's great to be here this morning. Boy, y- I'm not used to having light shining straight in my face, and uh, I have a bit of a receding hairline, so when I'm preaching, forewarning for next time I speak, which is June 24th, you might want to bring sunglasses to avoid the glare off the forehead. Well, I don't know what it's like when your family gets together, but I have a brother and a sister. I'm actually the youngest of three kids, the most irresponsible. That's the part of the youngest. We don't like to be in charge of anything, but we don't like anybody in charge of us either. So we kind of live life as it happens and frustrate and drive everybody else nuts. But when my brother and sister organize family gatherings, it's great to get together, and we do a number of things. It usually involves food. Always, food is the greatest thing to gather around. We love to sing. We come from a strong Mennonite musical background, so we love to sing together. But invariably along the way, we also tell a lot of stories. And of course, and I remember when I was younger and went to gatherings, family gatherings, and when older people start telling stories, everybody, kids kind of roll their eyes, and here we go again. But those stories are really, really tremendously important because they're part of who we are. We have stories that we hand down from generation to generation. We tell crazy stories about ourselves. Sometimes I realize that some of the stories we've told with when my son was around listening, and his eyes would get big, and I could say, "Oh, he's going to go off and try this," and that wasn't really the idea. But the stories become part of your identity, part of who you are as a family. The stories that point was kind of driven home a couple of years ago when we had one of those gatherings, and we had found, or my sister had found, a reel-to-reel tape. I don't know if you know what that is. Uh, about that was when she left home at 16, 17 and was living in Winnipeg. My dad was doing radio work. They would send tape messages. That was before the time where you didn't spend a lot of money phoning people because it's expensive. So you sent tape messages, so we sat there and listened to them, and it was kind of interesting, very emotional to hear the voices of your parents who've since passed on. And my daughter came up with the idea, says, you need to do something like that for my kids, so that sometime or another, when you aren't around, they can still listen to your voices. So important to have those backstories to our lives because they form a significant part of our identity. So today I want to start a series that I'm going to continue on the Sundays that I speak, which is usually going to be the last Sunday of the month. That it's a study of a book that for me has become one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, partly because it's short and it's understandable. I got to admit, I get bogged down in Leviticus and Numbers, and all the prophets become a little bit depressing after a while. But this is a very uplifting story. It starts out not so great, but it ends up really good. And it's the book of Ruth. It's 4 chapters long. It's really just a short story. And some people say, well, it's just a short romance. You could make one of those Hallmark movies out of it. But when you take a closer look at Ruth, it is so much more than that. When you look at how it begins and how it ends, you realize this book, there's a purpose behind writing it more than just telling a short story of the lives of people who lived so many years ago. And so today, as we start out, what I want to do is take the first 7 verses, and it's particularly the first 5, but I wanted to add in 6 and 7 to kind of give a sense of our continuation on to the next time we meet to talk about this. But these first verses give the backstory to the story. And if you don't get the backstory to the story itself loses its significance. It pales in terms of meaning and its depth of meaning for us in terms of what we can get out of it. So we do well to pay attention to the backstory because then we begin to understand the significance of what is taking place as we look at the rest of the story. Often the introduction to books, we pass over them really quickly. And we do ourselves a disfavor because we can lose the significance of what we're talking about. So the words of these verses, they're read for you, and I'm going to refer to them, and I'm going to stop along the way and talk a little bit about what the meaning is. So today we're kind of going to take these verses verse by verse, section by section, phrase by phrase. And as we do along the way, I want to be able to pull out some ways that we can begin to anticipate how God works out his purposes in our lives and was working out his purposes in the lives of the people who lived way back in these days. And so the writer, the narrator, begins telling this story. And by the way, this story would have been one that would have been handed out from generation to generation. It would have been one of those things that when families got together, they told and retold this story. And it didn't really take written form until probably at least a couple hundred years later, after the events actually took place. And so it took place back, it says, in the days when judges ruled. So that he already anchors it in history. So it's not just a once upon a time and they lived happily ever after kind of story. It's not a fantasy. He's anchoring it in real time. In the days when the judges judged, the judges ruled in the land. That time goes back to about 1200 to roughly about 1020 BCE. When you look at those times, and you can read about it in the book of Judges, which comes just before the book of Ruth, we find that these were really the dark ages of Israel. These years were marked by chaos. Political chaos, social chaos, religious chaos. There was apostate religions all over. The Israelites had come into the land. Joshua had died. Remember, Moses led them out of Egypt. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, got to the edge of the Jordan River, and then Moses died, and Joshua led them back in to settle into what they called the Promised Land. Joshua has died. And it says at the beginning of Judges in 1, and I think in about chapter 2, that after Joshua and his generation passed on, a whole generation rose that neither knew the Lord nor knew and understood what God had done for them. Now, that is actually a bit of an indictment on the generations because they weren't doing what they were ordered to do, which is to teach their children and to pass on the heritage that they had in what God had done for them and taking them out of Egypt and bringing them this far. But this generation, and it was a time where there wasn't a central king. The last verse in Judges says there was no king in the land, and everyone did as they saw fit or saw right in their own eyes. That is the definition of anarchy. Anybody who doesn't like central government, sometimes even bad central government, is better than no central government. Not always, but sometimes. The situation becomes total anarchy and is marked by violence and lawlessness. When they weren't fighting against other lands or other nations, they were infighting. There was tribal wars going on. And periodically they'd cry out to God, and God raised up a judge who would then come and help them get things back on track. And then once you know it, after things were back on track for a while, they'd go back off the tracks again. So this story is anchored in that time, but it gives us a window into the lives of people who lived in that time and lived out their lives, their everyday, ordinary lives, doing their best to succeed, to survive, and to serve God's purposes. So it says, in the days when judges rule. By the way, I like anchoring biblical history in history of other places, because so often I don't know, I grew up churched, okay? I grew up going to Sunday school, hearing all the Bible stories. And someplace in my mind, there was this history that was Bible history over here, and then there was human history over here, and the two things didn't seem to intersect with each other. And that can lead us to have a misleading idea that God's involved in Bible history but never involved in the rest. Just to give you an example, is around the same time that the land at the time of the judges, Beijing was beginning to just have its early first settlements. If you went to Mexico, the Olmec civilization, which ruled there for about 300 years, was just beginning to take place as well. The Trojan War was taking place in Greece. All these other things were taking place around the world. And God is as interested in those things as he is in those things that are taking place that are recorded in Scripture. We need to keep that in mind. So the writer says, in the days that when judges judged, there was a famine in the land. Now this just kind of compounds things completely. And the word that he uses there for famine is, it's a time of extreme hunger. In other words, it isn't just going to the store and saying, oh, they don't have bread today, so I'll come back tomorrow. There was simply no production of food at all. So now you have this combination of conflict and famine. The two things feed off each other. Famine often results in conflict, and conflict often results and exacerbates famine and food. So you have a desperate situation in a land, and here's people just simply getting by and trying to survive. There are places like that today. I went online to just check and see where some of those places are. And Sudan is in the news. Afghanistan has kind of fallen off the news, but it's the same thing taking place. We know of the war that's taking place in Ukraine. We hear of all these places. And I think the writer of this story reminds us of the fact that in the middle of all that chaos and that conflict that is taking place, there are everyday, ordinary people just like you and I who are simply doing what they can to try to survive in those situations. And that's what we find here. So there's a famine in the land. And it says, a man from Bethlehem of Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, when we read stories in the Bible, and Jesus told stories, by the way, lots of them, and there's a purpose there. A story is meant to draw you into the story. It's meant for you to find your place in the story. Maybe there's a character you identify with. Maybe there's an experience that one of the characters is going through that you identify with. But another important thing when we read stories as they're recorded in Scripture is to put ourselves back into the time of the people who are first listening to the story being told and try to understand what they're hearing, because sometimes they hear something we don't hear. And so when one of the first who would hear this, who is of Jewish origin, of Hebrew origin, would hear this story being told, the first thing he would say is, so what is this man leaving the promised land, the land of Canaan, the place where God has put them to live, set them out to live, to go, of all places, to Moab? Moab was one of those places that they were prohibited from engaging with. In fact, the Moabites it was said, you were not to allow them into the temple. You're not to allow them to engage with them in any kind of way. And here's this man from Bethlehem, which ironically means house of bread. And in the house of bread, there is no bread. So he's going to where? He's doing the 80-kilometer trek to a land of Moab to find food. Now, I'm a dad. I'm a father and a husband. And you do what you need to do to put food on the table, don't you? When you get up every morning and you come down and your kids are sitting at the table and saying, Daddy, what are we going to eat today? Mommy, what are we going to have today? And say, I'm sorry, there's nothing in the cupboards. There's nothing in the stores. We don't have anything. You eventually do what you need to do, and I think this dad is simply doing what he needs to do to feed his family. Over the last number of years, we've made regular trips into Cuba. And Cuba is one of those places where it has a repressive government that only allows out news out of the country that they want people to hear. And when you travel through the country and you begin to talk to people about the situation there, you hear a whole different thing than what you hear on the news. And in the 90s, when the whole Soviet Union, was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they pulled out of there, their economy in Cuba collapsed because they artificially had propped up their economy. And what most of the public don't realize is that there was rampant starvation going on in this country. But that news never leaked out, never came out. I talked to one man who said yes. He says he remembers as a young boy of about 12 years old, getting up and his mother had a plátano, plantain, and she peeled it up, cut it into about 4 or 5 different pieces so the kids could eat. Took the peeling, roasted it up, and ground it up, and made something similar to a bread, and said, "This is what we have to eat." And she and his parents went without eating that day. Starvation, hunger, we call it food deprivation. Food insecurity is a big term that we use today. These are the things that are driving this man to leave this country, to go to a place that would be otherwise unthinkable for him. But as we look at this situation, I think one of the things that comes off the text to me, it's not directly said. In fact, God is only mentioned directly twice in this whole book of directly intervening in the life of the people. But it tells me that in the middle of the darkest of times, when we have no awareness of God's presence at all or what he might be doing, God still is at work, bringing about his plan and his purposes. And he works through the movement of people who maybe even are doing things that we find questionable in terms of what the results are. It becomes even a little bit more stark when we realize that in the following verse, the writer, the storyteller here, identifies them by name. He or she identifies the man as his name is Elimelech. And there's another irony, because Elimelech means God is my king. God is king. And then there's Naomi, and her name means pleasant or friendly or good. And then there's the names of the 2 boys. Now, as I've studied this and read different people, sometimes too much is made out of the names. And actually, the only name that the writer brings back and says and brings into play at later on and in a later chapter is the name of Naomi. And he begins to talk about that. So we got to be careful we don't make too much of what the writer doesn't make too much out of. While we're on that, I would also want to very quickly say that as I've studied this text and read different people's interpretations of it, there's a tendency to read the famine, for instance, as judgment, God's judgment on the people. But the writer never makes sense that makes that correlation at all. And later on, when some of the key individuals in this text here, as we're going to see in a few minutes here, die, they also look at those as maybe their judgment as having left the land left Bethlehem to go to Moab, or taken on and married Moabitess women. But the writer, again, makes no correlation there. He leaves that open for us. Let me venture something that has occurred to me. And that is that how we understand how God works sometimes, especially when we see God as being condemning and judgmental, I suspect it says more about us than it says about God. Because the God that I meet in the person of Jesus is anything but condemning and judgmental. And I think in Jesus we have for us a representation of who God really is or what he is really like. In fact, when we read listen to Jesus' parables, so many of them were meant to correct those misunderstandings that the people in his day, the very religious right people had in his day, of God being that kind of judgmental and condemning God. So as we read this, we need to be careful that we don't jump to those kind of conclusions. So he gives us the names of the man, his wife, and the 2 sons. And it says they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. Now again, if you were a Jewish person listening to it, your ears would perk up, because you would realize that is the same designation that was given to Jesse, who was King David's dad. But we'll come back to that later on. And it says, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, notice there's a shift here. It says, at the beginning it says he went to Moab to sojourn there. In other words, he was living as a kind of as a resident alien. He's dependent. His idea was when they first went there was just to stay for a little while. But then by the time we get to this verse, it says they lived there. In other words, they settled down. So far, we see this family has moved, is looking for a better life, is looking for food, looking for a place where they can survive because of the desperate situation that they find in their homeland. But then the next very verse gives us a very terse, very matter-of-fact statement. It says, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Pretty stark, just a report of fact, not emotional at all. Here's something else that I want to point out before we get into this part of it, is that God works. His purpose is through very ordinary people in some of the most ordinary places that you and I wouldn't even think of. I think that should be encouraging to us. Do you ever think that your life is somewhat insignificant? That what kind of place would you be able to find in God's work? We often expect to work through the mellow, the dramatic and big kind of way, in a big way. But all through this text, all through this story, we find God working through very ordinary people. There are no prophets, priests, or kings. They're just simply ordinary people going about their everyday, ordinary lives, doing their best to survive and to serve God's purposes. I think Paul, when he writes in Romans chapter 12 at the very beginning, and I like Eugene Peterson's translation of that, he says, present your everyday, ordinary life, your waking up, getting up, going to work, eating and sleeping life. Present that to God as your act of worship. God does more things through the ordinary people in ordinary ways, and they're living their ordinary everyday lives, than he does in the melodramatic things that we often pay most attention to. So Elimelech dies, and it says Naomi is left alone, left behind, so to speak, with her 2 sons. Then it goes on to say these 2 boys take on wives. And again, there might be some raised eyebrows by a Jewish audience saying, why would they be marrying Moabitess women? They were forbidden actually to do that kind of thing. But the writer's not sitting in judgment. He's simply stating a fact. He's simply reporting, this is the story that you need to understand. And as we get on through this story, we'll find that God works out his plan and purposes in different ways that we would not expect. One is he tends to often work through our times of greatest pain and greatest hurt. He can open up doors and avenues for you to be part of what he's doing, sometimes through those experiences of greatest pain. I've shared before of our experience with our son, who at an early age got into the drug situation, and eventually in his 30s died of an overdose. Darkest day of my life. I can relive it, and it was probably the one day I wish I could forget. But throughout that experience of being the dad of a drug-addicted son, and through all those times and through the time of going through processing his death, God has opened up avenues for us to reach into the lives of people and be a source of encouragement and comfort there. In fact, within about a month or so of his death, we weren't even able to yet still had his memorial service because the coroner had not released his body. And somebody I knew who had been part of our church in the past called me up and said, Don, our son was getting ready to get married, and his prospective father just died of an overdose. Would you be able to do the funeral? I was still processing my grief, but it really occurred to me that said, who else would be better situated to sit with a family and work through those situations? Listen, your source of greatest pain can be the place of greatest effective ministry for God. Don't waste the hurt. Don't cover it up, don't push it away, don't repress it, but find ways to allow God to use that in your life to connect with others. It'll be different for each one of us. It'll be different for each one of us, but it's there. God works in different ways to bring about his plans and purposes. And what we see as tragedy and crisis that seems to shut down life for us doesn't shut down God's work. It doesn't even detour it. I believe you did a study through Philippians recently. Paul, writing Philippians from the jail, says, you see this, he's writing to the Philippians who were concerned about his well-being. He says, you see this as detrimental to the whole thing of the gospel. But he says, that's so totally wrong. It's because I'm here in chains that I've been able to reach into the house of Caesar, which I would otherwise never had. So Elimelech dies. Her 2 sons then pass away as well. And there, at the end of verse 6, it says, and Naomi was left without her husband and without her 2 sons. Now, in our time, we have a lot of safety nets that help people out. We have networks of social services and different things. It's not to take away from the grief or the pain, by the way. It's just that we have a way of doing that. In her day, I want to stop here and just kind of wrap ourselves, our hearts and minds around her situation. She's already older for her time, a woman in a foreign land. She's a widow, and she doesn't have sons. For her, in her time, for a woman in her time, their lives depended on having a significant male in their life to provide for them and to protect them. She was not only left without any way of providing provision for her own needs, she was left very vulnerable in terms of not having anybody there to totally protect her. She is about as destitute and desperate as you can probably get in that time. When we move on to verse 6, then there's finally this kind of ray of hope. And it says, when she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to and had then provided food for his people, she then decided, okay, that's where I need to go. We don't know how much time passed by. We're not given a kind of timeline. What we know is that these first 5 or 6 verses probably cover a time span of close to 10 years, a little bit more. The rest of the book will probably cover a time span of a couple years. But without this backstory, we don't have the deep significance of all the good things, the things that are going to take place farther on. And so what she determines is to say, I need to go back home. I need to head back in. I want to touch on here a little bit just that another thing that's going to come up as we go through this of how God works. I already kind of mentioned it in some ways in passing, but God works in surprising ways. Number one that I see here is, and it's a very subtle shift that takes place. When we first begin to read the story, we see Elimelech being mentioned as the main man in charge. He's making the decision to move from Bethlehem to go to Moab. And it says Bethlehem, his wife, and his sons went. There's a subtle shift here after they died. It says now refers to Elimelech as Naomi's husband. And she's left with her sons, without her husband, and without her 2 sons. And so the shift of focus is now changed to her. And we may not find that necessarily so surprising, because if you are a woman in today's day and your husband passes away, your sons, you are left in charge of your own household. But it would be very difficult in her time for that to take place. But as we read through the rest of the story, what we find is Naomi steps up and begins to lead the way. God begins to work out his plan and his purpose, not only for her life, but for his own people, as we will discover along the way through this lady. He also does through a very surprising person, which is going to be Ruth. Ruth becomes this Moabitess that becomes part of the plan and purpose that God has for his people. When we get to the end of the story, we find that Ruth then is mentioned, or in the genealogy here of David, who becomes the greatest king that they had. I started out by saying that your backstory deeply influences, impacts who you are today. You may not even know it. And so I would encourage you here, your homework, if you like, over this next little while, is talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, you got older uncles and aunts, that know part of your family history and find out something about it and how your family, where you came out of and what caused you to move to this location, what were the influence, what were the forces at work. I've looked back into mine. My dad was very reluctant to talk very much about his childhood and past because it was extremely painful. See, my dad was born he was a German Mennonite born in, well, what was then Russia was part of what is today Ukraine. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, there was something much like what was taking place in the time of the judges taking place in their land. It was total anarchy because while they were in control of the government in Moscow, throughout the whole land, there was nothing. There was no control and no authority. It was lawlessness gone rampant. And what took place then was that there were marauding individuals who would go into some of these villages, kill all the men, violently assault all the women, and just take all their possessions. My dad was 9 years old when his father was a victim of that, and so was his mother. And they found themselves needing to flee. He remembers as a 9-year-old carrying his younger sister on his shoulders, who was then only about 4 years old, to try to escape. The following couple of years, as they kind of fled and moved from place to place, they underwent extreme hunger, starvation, where there was hardly any food for them to eat. Eventually, his mother decided that they needed to immigrate to Canada, except for that the only ones that could pass the physical test and be healthy enough to make the trip and be approved by the Canadian government were my dad and his older brother. So at age 12, and his older brother was age 16, they came on their own to Canada. And they ended up being sponsored then by a farmer in Manitoba, who basically looked at his sponsorship as getting free and what in many ways amounted to slave labor. He worked 12 to 15-hour days. His last grade of school that he actually completed was grade 7. All my life that I knew my dad, there were two things that were vitally important to him. Food, good food. We didn't have steak, but we always had food. We never went hungry. And I remember as a young boy going shopping with him and buying food in the local supermarket, grocery store. As soon as he always bought more than we needed, and we would walk out and there would be kids lined out, street kids out there who obviously didn't have enough to eat, and he would give out food. I remember him buying food and having it delivered to different people in our church that we attended because he knew they didn't have enough. We didn't have lots, but he gave out of what we had to make sure other people didn't go hungry, didn't experience how hungry he did. He always emphasized education and good books. And to this day, I have almost an obsession with good books. In fact, one of the drawbacks of retiring was I have a library of a couple thousand books that nobody else wants. So if you want some books, come on over. At least they'll work well as booster seats for your kids. But what he experienced, he passed on to me, even though I never experienced it. there's a lot of other things that have affected me as well in terms of the little bits that wore off on him that I didn't even realize had their source because he never talked about it. And the only reason I know about it is because my uncle, his older brother, did talk about it. And my cousin took the time to write these things down. Valuable aspects of my backstory that have been determining factors in who I am. The fact that he ended up walking away from what could have been a successful life, material life in Canada, and lived in Ecuador at a time when there were hardly roads through. They built a boat, and my sister remembers living as a 2-year-old on board this boat as they went up and down rivers. I would do the same thing. We are deeply influenced by the backstory. There's some negative things too. Know your backstory. What is yours? You see, you have a story. And you have your own story to live out. You're not here to live out somebody else's story. You're simply here to live out your story and to tell others about it. And as we go through the book of Ruth, while we don't see overtly places where God is at work, it's when we look back. And I encourage you, as you look back over your own story over these months that we look at the book of Ruth, and I'm going to encourage you to keep doing that, to look back over your own story. Look for those ways where God shows up or God has been at work, even though you were not aware of it. You know, the words of Jacob come to mind, that when he has this encounter with the angel of the Lord and he wrestles with him. And he says at the end of it, surely God was in this place. And I wasn't aware of it. It's only looking back sometimes we can see it, and we can be awed and amazed that God has been at work in our lives. And we can be encouraged to help others find that as well. Let's pray. And Father, thank you that you are faithful to us, even in those times when we may not be so faithful to you. That even in those times when we are living, sometimes as I have, in a wilderness of my own making, you have still been the carrying presence there in ways that I did not perceive it, in ways that we don't see it. But you're working our lives, drawing us and giving us opportunity to come back to you, or to find you along the way. And by so doing, we can become that catalyst in the lives of other people to discover where you might be at work in their lives as well. We thank you for that. May we be encouraged today as we spend time together with each other and with you. In Jesus' name I pray.